Welcome to the Deep Dive. Look, if you're searching for a story that, well, really captures the whole sweep of 20th century America, I mean, everything from desperate immigrants to building incredible wealth, reaching the absolute peak of political power, but then being just relentlessly haunted by tragedy, almost mythological levels of tragedy. Down at the Kennedys.
It really is the ultimate story of, an improbable American rise, but it's one where the absolute high point, specifically JFK's presidency, seemed to immediately trigger this devastating, almost endless series of losses and grief.
Yeah, it's staggering.
And for this deep dive, we've pulled together sources that trace this whole narrative. We're going way back, ancient roots in Ireland, then digging into the machinery, the mechanics of their political success, and bringing it right up to today, the modern, sometimes pretty controversial political landscape of 2025.
And interestingly, we're kicking this off not way back in the 19th century with the famine migration, but actually near the end of that main political generation. Okay, let's unpack. 2009, we're at the funeral mass for Ted Kennedy at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Basilica in Boston. And this wasn't just some family gathering.
Oh, not at all. This was huge. An event with immense political weight, almost historic, you could say. Think about who was there. 3 former U.S. presidents attended, plus the serving president at the time, Barack Obama.
Right.
And Obama gave one of the eulogies. His speech just perfectly nailed the central theme, the defining idea, really, of the whole dynasty story.
Which was? That
core paradox. A life of incredible public achievement defined just as much by unimaginable private suffering. Obama laid it out so clear. Ted's personal history, it was a list of devastations.
Yeah.
He lost 2 siblings, Joseph Jr. and Kathleen, before he even turned. Then he watched 2 more brothers, Jack and Bobby, icons really, taken violently, assassinated. And on top of that, his sister Eunice passed away just days before he did.
It's almost too much to comprehend.
And that's not even touching on Ted's own struggles. He barely survived a plane crash back in '64. Left him badly injured, permanent back problems, kind of eerily similar to Jack's war injuries, actually.
Huh. I didn't realize the parallel was that close.
Yeah. And then he watched his own kids go through terrible health crises. Cancer. One son even needed a leg amputation. He ended up burying 3 nephews. And of course, navigated his own significant public failings, setbacks that, really changed the whole course of his potential political career.
It's a life lived under this intense, almost unbearable generational spotlight, isn't it? Ted Kennedy's death, it really did feel like the end of that dominant political generation.
Absolutely. And a key point the sources emphasize is just the sheer continuity of their political presence. Think about this. When Ted's son, Patrick, left the House of Representatives just 2 years later, in 2011, that was the very first time since 1947, that a member of the Kennedy family wasn't holding political office somewhere in the U.S.
Wow, 64 years straight.
64 years? That's an incredible run of power. If you look across American history, that kind of longevity in one family is extremely rare. Maybe the Adams family way back or, the Bush family more recently, but even those feel a bit more broken up.
Right.
This continuous presence really shows how effective, how resilient that political machine built by Joe Kennedy Sr. actually was. So our mission here in this deep dive is to trace that whole remark. How does a family fleeing starvation, dying young in Boston tenements, become American royal? What was the sophisticated financial engine driving it? And why did this curse, this pattern of tragedy seem to follow them at every turn?
Okay, so to really grasp how improbable this all was, we need to start at the beginning, the very beginning. We have to go back to Ireland, centuries before the American dynasty even existed, to find the deep roots of the O'Kennedy.
That's right. Long before Ireland was fully conquered by the English crown, the country was structured around these various lordships, often fighting each other. The O'Kennedys, they were a recognized lord, held power in the Orange region, that's roughly modern Tipperary and Kilkenny, back in...
So centuries ago, they actually were a kind of ruling family, though obviously that status long gone, crushed really, by the time the Tudors conquered Ireland and the later colonization. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 19th century. This is the immediate starting point for the American dynasty, and their situation is, well, desperate. Pure economic desperation.
Yeah, the context here is absolutely crucial. In the 1840s, Ireland's population was huge, peaking at over 8 million people crammed onto the island, and the vast majority of the farmland, owned by a pretty small number of large landlords, mostly Anglo-Irish or English.
Right, which meant the average Irish farmer, the tenant farmer, was almost completely dependent on one single crop for survival.
The potato, exactly. And this total dependency created this massive vulnerability. So when the potato blight hit, it actually arrived on steamships and caused the crops to just turn black and rot in the fields in the mid-1840s. It was catastrophic. It triggered the Great Famine. The period they call Black 48, 1848, saw hundreds of thousands dying or just fleeing the country.
Fleeing for their lives.
Absolutely. And one of those fleeing was Patrick Kennedy, who would become Ted Kennedy's great-grandfather. Born 1823, County Wexford, son of just a modest farmer, he made that desperate voyage, landing in Boston in 1849.
And he managed to find work pretty quickly.
He did. He found work as a cooper, a barrel maker. Must have been a skill he learned back in Ireland.
But that first American foothold for the family, it was incredibly fragile. Patrick married another Irish immigrant, Bridget Murphy. They had 5 kids. But Patrick's time in America was just tragically short. He died only 9 years after he arrived in 1858. Probably cholera or TB, the infectious diseases that just ripped through those poor, crowded Irish neighborhoods in Boston.
It was a brutal environment. Bridget, his widow, she had to go back to work immediately, supported the family first as a maid, later as a hairdresser, and you really can't overstate the hostility. Anti-Irish feeling was intense back. Huge wave, poor Catholic immigrants showing up. They were seen as competition for jobs, a threat to the established social order.
But Bridget's youngest son, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, P.G. Kennedy, born the same year his father died, 1858. He became the real founder, the one who started building the family's wealth and political clout. He actually left school at 14 to help his mother. Started out working on the docks.
Right, just absorbing the grit, the economic reality of the Boston waterfront. But the transition from dock worker to, a man of substance, that's pure business smart. By the 1880s, PJ had saved enough money to buy his first saloon over in Haymarket Square.
Okay, the saloon business.
Yeah, and that first one was successful enough that he could expand, bought 2 more bars, and crucially, he set up his own distillery, started producing whiskey for wholesale.
And this is the key moment, isn't it? The pivot from just surviving or even doing okay financially to actually building power. PJ figured out that the very thing making the Irish targets, the fact that we're all packed into certain neighborhoods, could actually be leveraged politically.
He totally got it. He realized that controlling local businesses, community hubs like saloons, gave you a direct line to influence, to power.
And the saloon back then wasn't just a bar, right?
Exactly. That's a fascinating point the sources make. In 19th century Irish Boston, the saloon was like the community center. It was where you got news, found jobs, organized politically. PJ leveraged that influence directly. He got into politics with the Democratic Party, using that neighborhood power base to get elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives.
So he used politics to help his business.
Precisely. He was fundamentally a businessman who dabbled in politics, mainly to protect and grow his alcohol and real estate. His son, Joe Sr., he flipped that equation.
Right, the son. Joseph Kennedy Sr., Joe Sr., born 1888. If PJ laid that crucial groundwork, that local political and economic base, Joe Sr. was the relentless engine. He took that foundation and just turbocharged it, transforming a prominent Boston family into this dynastic force, laser-focused on achieving national political power.
The acceleration is immediate, isn't it? And substantial. Joe Sr. goes to Harvard, studies economics. He didn't exactly start from nothing, though. He got a big loan from his dad, PJ, used it to kind of muscle his way onto the board trust bank. And he definitely benefited from PJ's political connections to get seats on other corps. So not entirely self-made, but undeniably brilliant.
And a big part of his financial success was spotting trends, right? Especially in that booming post-World War I economy in the 20s.
Oh, yeah. He had a real eye for innovation. Famously, he invested huge amounts in Hollywood film studios right at the moment they were shifting to talkies movies. Sound with dialogue. That timing was impeccable. Made him an absolute fortune during the boom.
Okay, but this is where the rumors always come up. The bootlegging stuff during Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. Did he make serious money from illegal alcohol?
Look, it's one of the most persistent stories about him, constantly repeated. And yes, the family's original wealth came from the legal alcohol trade through PJ. And Josh Sr. definitely associated with, let's say, colorful figures, including some linked to organized crime in New York that was almost unavoidable for big financial players back then.
Got the evidence.
But the source material we reviewed is pretty consistent on. There is no concrete, verifiable proof that Joe Sr. was directly involved in large-scale bootlegging or smuggling up. Lots of smoke, maybe, but no definitive fire found in the credible historical.
Okay, regardless of exactly where every dollar came from, the sheer scale of his success is the main point. Historians estimate his wealth eventually hit hundreds of millions. In today's money, factoring in assets, he was basically a billion.
Easily. And this enormous wealth wasn't just accumulated, it was managed with this incredibly sophisticated long-term dynastic strategy. Joe Sr. saw wealth as, quote, the lubricant needed for lasting political success.
And his timing with real estate was
absolutely masterful, but simple. If you had the capital, when property prices just completely collapsed during the Great Depression in the early 30s, what did he do? He bought everything, invested massively in real estate.
Prime locations, too, like the Hyannisport compound, the famous Kennedy base.
Exact. He knew he could just sit on these assets for a decade, 2 decades, and the values would inevitably soar. It was almost a no-brainer for someone with his resources and foresight.
And then he set it up so the kids wouldn't have to worry about earning a living.
Precisely. He established these complex financial trusts. The explicit goal was to free his 9 children, 4 sons, Joseph Jr., Jack, Bobby, Ted, and the 5 daughters, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, from ever needing to work for him. Their only focus could be public service, political. That decision to basically engineer a generation of politicians fundamentally shaped everything that came after.
Compared to that, his own time in national politics seems almost like a side project, but a really important one. FDR appointed him head of the brand new SEC in 1934, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission.
Yeah, which was set up after the 29 crash to regulate Wall Street.
Which sounds ironic, given his background as a major Wall Street player.
It was hugely ironic, logical, because who knew the system's tricks better than him? But also shocking, the ultimate fox guarding the hen house, as critics screamed at the time. But surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly given his drive, his tenure was actually pretty effective. He brought in Wall Street insiders, people who knew the game, and helped build the regulatory framework that, in large part, still exists. It gave him huge political legitimacy.
And he repaid the favor to FDR.
He did. Published a book in 1936, I'm for Roosevelt, a big public endorsement of the New Deal. Huge boost for FDR's re-election campaign. And Roosevelt returned the favor, appointing Joe Sr. as the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain in 1938.
Ah, the ambassadorship. That didn't end well, did it?
No, it became highly controversial very quickly. He arrives in London just as Germany is pulling off the Anschluss, absorbing Austria. And during his couple of years there, Joe Sr. becomes deeply unpopular. He was known for being openly anti-Semitic, and he strongly backed Britain's policy at the time, which was appeasing Hitler.
He thought Britain should stay out of it.
Yeah, he believed Britain shouldn't get involved in another European war, figuring Hitler would eventually turn east towards the Soviet Union anyway. But his position just became completely untenable once Winston Churchill, the ultimate opponent of it, replaced Neville Chamberlain as prime minister. Churchill immediately started getting aid from Roosevelt back in Washington.
And Joe Sr.'s position was toast.
Exactly. By September 1940, he was recalled. And after that recall, Joe Sr. never sought higher office for him. His focus shifted entirely. All that immense wealth, all that status, all that ambition, it was now channeled into one single goal, making one of his sons president of the United States.
And the first hope, the one groomed for it initially, was the eldest son, Joseph Jr.
Joseph Jr., despite the fact that anti-Irish, anti-Catholic feeling was still a major force in American politics strong enough that it had crushed Al Smith's presidential run back in 19... Joe Sr. believed his son could overcome it.
But that primary ambition, focused on Joe Jr., was just instantly shattered. This is where we first encounter what people started calling the Kennedy curse, that really disturbing pattern of, premature deaths, illnesses, terrible accidents.
And the first victim of that, in terms of the political line, was Joseph Jr. himself. He was a decorated pilot in World War II. He was killed August 12, 1944, during something called Operation Aphrodite over England.
What was that operation?
It was incredibly risky. They were using old bomber planes, packing them full of explosives, and then planning to fly them remotely, like early drones, towards German V-weapon sites. The pilots were supposed to bail out before the planes reached the target zone.
But something went wrong.
Tragically, yes. The explosives on Joseph Jr.'s plane detonated way too early, before he and his co-pilot could jump clear. Killed them both.
God, horrific. And just like that, Joe Sr.'s meticulously laid plan was gone.
Instantly gone, he had to pivot, shift that whole formidable political machine toward the second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jack. But the tragedies just kept coming. It's eerie how often aviation disasters feature in this family's story.
Right.
Just 4 years later, 1948, Kathleen Kennedy, they called her Kick, she'd married into the British aristocracy, kind of defied the family's strict Catholic expectations. She was killed in a plane crash over France, just on holiday. Another plane crash.
Unbelievable. And then there's the story of Rosemary, which is just profoundly tragic and deeply unsettling in a different way.
It really is. Rosemary, one of the daughters, she reportedly struggled with mood swings, some erratic behavior in the early 1940s, especially after she came back from Britain where things had been difficult during the war buildup.
And Joe Sr., in his relentless drive for family perfection, for political viability for his sons, he looked for a medical...
He did. And at that time, a new procedure was being championed, almost hailed as a miracle cure for mental illness and behavioral problems, the prefrontal lobotomy. Joe Sr. agreed to have Rosemary undergo the operation in 19...
And the result?
It was an absolute disaster. The operation was completely unsuccessful. It left Rosemary with severely limited cognitive abilities, essentially the mental capacity of a young child for the rest of her life.
Oh my God.
And here's the part that speaks volumes about Joe Sr.'s control, maybe his shame. He had her institutionalized, hidden away in a facility in Wisconsin. And the sources are very clear on this. He didn't fully tell her siblings what had happened. The horrific outcome, even where she was, they didn't know the full truth for decades.
For decades? How did they finally find out?
It wasn't until Joe Sr. himself suffered a massive debilitating stroke in 1961 that the full, awful truth about Rosemary's condition and the lobotomy finally came out to Eunice and the other. Imagine carrying that secret for 20 years.
That's incredible. And you can see how learning that must have just profoundly impacted the sisters, especially Eunice later on. We'll definitely come back to that.
Absolutely. So with Joe Jr. gone, the focus falls squarely on Jack. Now, Jack had survived the war. He served in the Navy in the South Pacific, 1943, famously became a war hero after his PT boat was sunk, rescued several of his men.
Right, PC-109.
That's the one. But that whole experience, especially the rescue, left him with the chronic, lifelong back injury. Severe pain. That meant for the rest of his life, he was relying on increasingly strong painkillers just to function day to day.
So after the war, he jumps into politics.
Well, after a very brief stint in journalism, he ran for the House of Representatives. Sources say he was initially kind of lukewarm about it, actually, more interested in big international issues than, local Boston politics.
But that changed.
It did,
Yeah.
Especially when he ran for the Senate in Massachusetts in 1952 and won. He was only 35. He really found his footing in the Senate, particularly on the foreign relations. And during these years, the 50s, the Kennedys built this incredibly sophisticated, well-oiled political machine back in Massachusetts, fueled by Joe Sr.'s money and PJ's old local connections, basically ensuring they could keep winning elections.
Okay, so fast forward to 1960. He decides to run for president. Big challenge. He's young. He's Catholic. He's a liberal from New England, and the Democratic Party is still heavily influenced by the conservatives.
Huge challenge. But he won the nomination at the Democratic National. And to try and bridge that North-South divide, to bring the conservative Southern Dems on board, he made a very strategic choice for his running.
Lyndon B. Johnson, L2J, the powerful Senate Majority Leader from Texas.
Exactly. A Southerner, a party insider designed to balance the ticket, and the election itself against Richard Nixon, famously one of the closest in America. JFK barely won the popular vote, like 49.7% to Nixon's 49.5%. Tiny margin. Wow.
But he secured a solid win in the Electoral College, 303 votes. He won by carrying key northern states, New England, New York, Pennsylvania, places like that.
So his presidency, 1961 to 1963, short, but incredibly eventful, jam-packed with crises.
Absolutely. Right off the bat, he inherits the Bay of Pigs disaster in Cuba, that failed CIA-backed invasion attempt. A total fiasco that he later blamed the CIA for, pushing Castro even closer to the Soviets.
Which sets the stage for
the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
October 1962. 13 days where the world held its breath, closer than ever before or since to full-scale nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
And domestically?
Domestically, he was initially a bit hesitant on civil rights, but eventually became a real champion for the cause, a move that deeply split the Democratic Party, pitting the northern liberal wing against the southern segregationist wing.
And the Cold War context dominated
everything. Massive investment in NASA. The race to the moon was a direct response to the Soviet. And significantly, he substantially increased direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, sending advisors, ramping things up. And then Dallas, November 22nd, assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. And given everything that was going on, the Cold War tensions, the fights with the CIA, organized crime, the civil rights battles, it may be not surprising that conspiracy theories about his death just took hold immediately and have never really gone away.
No, they haven't. And the impact was just seismic. The torch, the political baton, instantly passed to the next brother in line, Robert Francis Kennedy.
Bobby, who had already made a name for himself before JFK was even president, right? Going after organized crime.
Yeah, early in his career, after law school, he focused heavily on investigating links between organized crime and the powerful.
Tell us more about that. Why was going after the Teamsters such a big deal? What made it define Bobby's early career?
Well, you have to understand the Teamsters Union, led by the infamous Jimmy Hoffa, wasn't just a labor union. It was this massive organization with enormous financial reach, huge political influence, and crucially, widespread allegations of being deeply infiltrated by organized crime figures. So Bobby, as the chief counsel for the Senate committee investigating them, he went after Hoffa and other union leaders, accusing them of corruption, misusing funds, ties to the mob. It was this incredibly public, high-stakes comfort. A young, ambitious lawyer taking on one of the most powerful, feared labor leaders in the country.
It must have generated huge headlines.
Oh, massive headlines. Constant news coverage. Those televised hearings with Bobby grilling Hoffa, it instantly made Bobby Kennedy a national figure in his own right, separate from his brother's growing political fame. Gave him this reputation as a tough, fearless crusader against corruption.
And then JFK appoints him Attorney General in 1961.
Right. He becomes the nation's top law enforcement officer, absolutely central to the administration's efforts on civil rights, pushing for enforcement of desegregation. He was also right there in the inner circle during the big foreign policy crises, the Berlin Wall going up, the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was Jack's closest advisor, the person he trusted.
So after Jack's assassination, what does Bobby do? Does he immediately try to run for president himself?
No, not immediately. He knew challenging the sitting president, LBJ, in 1964 would be politically impossible, especially with the nation grieving. So instead, he ran for a U.S. Senate seat representing New York in 1965 and won. And it's during his time in the Senate over the next few years that his own political views start to shift and really...
This brings up that recurring question about the Kennedys and policy shifts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They famously changed their stance on things like supporting McCarthyism early on, then condemning it, being cool on civil rights initially, then becoming champions. Bobby's shift on Vietnam seems like another major example. Was this genuine growth, political maturity, or just smart political calculation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources we looked at suggest it's probably a mix of both throughout their careers, but in Bobby's specific case regarding Vietnam, there seems to be a strong element of genuine political maturation. Remember, his own brother Jack had deepened U.S. involvement, but as Bobby watched LBJ drastically escalate the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops, mass bombing, the draft, he started to have serious... By 1968, he concluded the war wasn't just strategically unwinnable, it was morally wrong. And he was willing to break publicly with his family's past stance and with the current Democratic president. That suggests a real evolution driven by conviction as much as calculation.
And 1968 itself was just pure chaos in America. The Vietnam War tearing the country apart, the huge anti-war protests, and then Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated April.
A nation on edge. And into that turmoil, Bobby jumps into the Democratic primary race. He runs explicitly against the war, focusing on poverty, trying to build this coalition, working-class whites, minorities, and young anti-war activists.
And his campaign really took off, didn't it?
It gained incredible momentum. It started looking more and more likely that he could actually win the Democratic nomination, maybe even heal some of the deep divisions in the party and the country. But then, June 5th, 1968, he just won the crucial California primary, campaigning late at night, walking through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
He was shot by Sirhan Sirhan.
Yeah, he died about 25 hours later. And Ted Kennedy, the youngest brother, had to deliver another eulogy for a murdered brother. By this point, the litany of loss he had to recite was unbearable. He said, "My brother need not be idealized, simply remembered as a good and decent, saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop." And he explicitly named the others they'd lost, Joe, Kath, Jack, a public accounting of the family stagger. So with Bobby gone, assassinated just 5 years after Jack, Ted Kennedy is suddenly the last of Joe Sr.'s intended political heirs. He was already a U.S. Senator representing Massachusetts too, but now, at only 36, he's thrust into this role of family patriarch, the keeper of the flame, the chief political standard bearer for the Kennedy.
And he, too, had already had his brush with the so-called curse, right?
Yay.
Plane crash.
That's right. Back in 1964, he was in a small plane that crashed in western Massachusetts. The pilot and an aide were killed. Ted himself was pulled from the wreckage alive, but very bad. Serious back injuries, internal injuries, ailments that plagued him for the rest of his life. That chronic pain, just like his brother Jack had endured. It's another one of those uncanny parallels.
Despite that, and despite the weight of everything, he builds this incredible Senate career. The Lion of the Senate, they called him.
An amazing career, really. He held that Massachusetts Senate seat for 47 years, became one of the most effective, most powerful legislators in modern American history, a real force within the Democratic Party. And he managed this sustained focus even while dealing with more family health crises. One son had severe asthma. Another son, Ted Jr., battled bone cancer as a child, which tragically led to his leg being amputated.
There was always talk of him running for president, especially in the 70s. But it never quite happened. And there's one huge defining reason why that door remained effectively sealed for him, isn't there? Chappaquiddick, 1969.
Chappaquiddick, yeah, July 18th, 1969. Ted was on Chappaquiddick Island, off Martha's Vineyard, attending a party, a reunion for aides who had worked on Bobby's 68 campaign. Late that night, after 11 p.m., he left the party, driving. With him in the car was Mary Jo Kopechne, one of those former Bobby.
And he took a wrong turn.
He took a wrong turn onto an unlit dirt road leading to a narrow, unrailed wooden bridge called Dyke. The car went off the bridge, plunged into the tidal pond below, and overturned in the water. Ted managed to escape, swim free, but Mary Jo Kopechne drowned inside the submerged car.
But the immediate accident wasn't the core of the scandal, was it? It was what happened next.
Exactly. The scandal, the controversy that would haunt him forever was his actions after escaping the car. He didn't report the accident to the police immediately. In fact, he waited until around 10 a.m. the next morning, nearly 9 hours later.
9 hours? What was his explanation for that delay?
When he finally made a public statement, a televised address, he claimed his actions in those hours made no sense, even to him. He spoke of shock, exhaustion, confusion, maybe just the cumulative emotional weight of all the recent family tragedies clouding his judgment. He said he wondered if some awful curse did actually hang over all the
What were the legal consequences?
minimal. He pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident causing injury. He received a 2-month suspended jail sentence, but the political consequences were devastating and permanent.
It killed his presidential ambition.
Absolutely. The unanswered questions about that night, the delay in reporting, the whiff of privilege or cover-up, it created this cloud of suspicion that never fully... It's widely accepted that Chappaquiddick is the single biggest reason he ultimately decided not to run for president in 1972 or 1976 when he might have been the frontrunner. He did eventually challenge Jimmy Carter for the nomination in 1980, but lost. That door, the presidential door, was effectively slammed shut by Chappaquiddick.
But even without reaching the White House, Ted Kennedy found another way to have a massive political impact, didn't he? Redefining what a senator could achieve.
He absolutely did. His legislative record is immense. He became a master legislator. One huge area was the Northern Ireland peace process. He played a really central, critical role from the American side, using his clout as a leading Irish-American figure to build trust, facilitate negotiations between the British government, the Irish government, and the various factions in Northern Ireland.
In healthcare, too, right? That was his signature issue for decades.
For decades. He was a relentless champion for expanding U.S. healthcare coverage and access. Year after year, he pushed for reforms, laid the groundwork for later legislation. Even when the political winds, it became his defining domestic policy passion.
It's also worth noting the sources mentioned his struggles, his periodic heavy drinking, which was sometimes public. And there's speculation, maybe informed speculation, that he might have suffered from a form of PTSD, given the sheer amount of trauma and public scrutiny he endured, especially during the 1960s.
It's impossible to know for sure, of course, but given the assassinations, the plane crash, the constant pressure, it's certainly plausible. It adds another layer to understanding the complexities of his long career and life.
Now, while the sons were the ones groomed for electoral politics, the Kennedy women were forging their own incredibly impactful paths, even though the political arena itself was largely closed off to them back.
That's a crucial point. Remember, before the 1980s, it was incredibly rare for women to hold high federal office. Only 8 women total had ever been elected to the U.S. Senate before 19. So that path wasn't really open to Rose Kennedy's daughter.
But they made their mark elsewhere, starting with Rose herself, the matriarch.
Rose Kennedy was the anchor, managed the schedules, the image, campaigned tirelessly for her sons. And later in life, she became a dedicated advocate for various charities, and particularly for issues affecting senior citizens, a formidable figure in her own right.
And then there's the next generation, profoundly shaped by what happened to their sister Rosemary.
Profound. Eunice Kennedy Shriver is probably the most famous of the daughters globally, and her life's work was a direct response to Rosemary's tragedy, the full, awful details of which, remember, she and her siblings only learned after their father's stroke in 1961.
She saw the injustice, the lack of opportunities for people with intellectual disability.
Exactly. And she decided to do something about it. In 1962, she started a summer day camp, Camp Shriver, in her own backyard for children with intellectual disability. That small camp grew, evolved, and became the foundation for the Special Olympics, with the first international games held in Chicago in 1988.
An incredible legacy.
Truly transformative. The Special Olympics is now this massive global movement, active in over 170 countries. Eunice's work completely changed attitudes and opportunities for millions. She rightly received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1984.
And her sister, Jean Kennedy Smith, followed a similar path, also inspired by Rose.
Very similar. In 1974, Jean founded an organization called Very Special Arts, or VSA. The goal was to provide opportunities in the arts for people with intellectual or physical disabilities again, a direct response to the isolation and lack of creative outlets Rose experienced. Later, Jean also served a long and significant term as the U.S. ambassador to Ireland from 1993 to 2009, reinforcing those deep family ties. She was the last surviving child of Joe and Rose, passing away in 20. But even as that generation began to pass, the pattern of tragedy, the curse, unfortunately didn't end. It continued to strike the next generations, the grandchildren and great-grand, often in horribly public.
That pattern of aviation disasters returned too in the 90s.
It did, with probably the most high-profile Kennedy death since the assassination. In July 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., JFK Jr., John, massive celebrity figure, his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren Bessette, all died when the small plane JFK Jr. was piloting crashed into the Atlantic Ocean near Martha's Vineyard.
What went wrong?
The investigation concluded that Kennedy, who was actually a relatively inexperienced pilot, especially in challenging conditions, likely became disoriented while trying to fly over water at night, suffering from spatial disorientation and lost control of the craft. Another Kennedy, another plane crash. It was just devastating.
And the cluster of tragedies seems particularly acute within Bobby Kennedy's branch of the family, his children and grand.
It's truly heartbreaking when you list them. Bobby's son, David, died from a drug overdose back in 1974. Then his son, Michael, was killed in a skiing accident in Aspen in 1997.
And it continued into this century.
Yeah. His granddaughter, Source Kennedy Hill, died of an accidental overdose in 2019 at the family compound in Hyannis. And then just a year later, in 2020, his granddaughter, Maeve Kennedy McKeon, and her young 8-year-old son, Gideon, both drowned in a canoeing accident. It's just an almost unbelievable litany of loss concentrated in one.
Despite all this, and even after Ted's death seemed to mark the end of that dominant political era in 2009, the family name continues to pop up in high-profile public service, doesn't it?
It does. The political instinct, or maybe the sense of obligation, seems to persist. Maria Shriver, Eunice's daughter, was, of course, married to Arnold Schwarzenegger and served as the very visible First Lady of California from 2003 to 2011.
And they got back into elected office fairly quickly after that brief gap post-2011.
They did. Joe Kennedy III, who is Bobby Kennedy's grandson, was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts in 2013. He got a huge amount of national attention in 2018, chosen to give the official Democratic response to President Trump's state of... For a while, he looked like the potential next big thing for the family politically.
He ran for Senate in 2020 but lost the primary, but he's still involved.
Yes, he lost that Senate primary bid in Massachusetts, but he's now serving as the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. So he's directly continuing the kind of diplomatic work that his great-uncle Ted was so involved.
And Caroline Kennedy, JFK's daughter.
She's also followed that diplomatic path, serving as U.S. ambassador first to Japan under Obama, and more recently as ambassador to Australia from 2022 up until earlier this year. So presence is definitely still there, even if it's shifted more towards diplomacy and specific roles rather than aiming direct at presidency.
Okay, but the most recent and arguably the most controversial chapter in the modern Kennedy political story involves Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr.
Yes. Bobby Kennedy's son, nephew JFK. His background is certainly complex. The sources note he struggled significantly with serious drug addiction in his youth, heroin addiction specific, and there were reports that some family members felt his struggles influenced younger siblings and cousins towards similar dangerous paths.
But he overcame that addiction.
He did. He eventually got clean and for many years built a really successful and prominent career as an environmental lawyer. He won major cases against large corporations for polluting rivers, earned a strong reputation in that field.
But then his focus shifted quite dramatically.
It really did. In more recent years, he pivoted away from primarily environmental work towards health matters, but specifically towards very controversial, widely disputed views, particularly regarding vaccines, and also claims about harmful food additives, like carcinogenic industrial byproducts supposedly in common food.
Views that put him way outside the mainstream, scientifically and politically.
Way outside. A complete break from traditional Democratic Party positions and established scientific consensus on vaccinations, for example. And it was really on this anti-establishment, health-focused platform that he launched his own political ambitions.
He ran for president in 2024.
Yes, first challenging Biden within the Democratic primary, then shifting to run as an independent candidate, which was fascinating in itself, the Kennedy name, once the absolute symbol of establishment Democratic power, now being carried by an independent outsider candidate challenging both parties.
And how did that end?
Well, late in the 2024 election cycle, a significant political move happened. The sources detail that RFK Jr. dropped his independent bid and formally endorsed Donald Trump for president.
Wow.
And reportedly, in return for that endorsement, he received a promise for a major cabinet position if Trump won. Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, Trump did win, and RFK Jr. took up that role in February of 2025.
Which must have immediately created tension given his views.
Immense tension. His appointment was highly controversial from day one. And his stance on vaccines and public health remains a critical issue, especially because, as the source material notes, unfortunately, a large measles outbreak occurred across several U.S. states later in 2025.
Right.
So that situation puts his leadership at HHS and that iconic Kennedy name right back in the spotlight, right in the center of a major public health debate, demanding really careful, neutral analysis of his actual policy actions versus past, highly controversial statements. It's the latest complex turn in this long family saga. So after tracing this whole arc, this extraordinary multi-generational story, what does it all mean? What does this deep dive really show us? Fundamentally, I think the Kennedy Dynasty is a story about the sheer improbability of it all.
Yeah, it really is. You start with Patrick Kennedy, fleeing the famine, arriving in Boston in 1849, dead within 9 years in the tenement. And just over a century later, his grandson is the youngest elected president of the United States. It's staggering. Their story is just completely woven into the fabric of the 20th century, especially those incredibly dramatic, tumultuous 1960s.
And that duality, that contrast is always there. It's the defining feature of their legacy. On one hand, you have immense political success, ambition, a genuine, documented desire for public service. But running right alongside that constantly is this unrelenting private, the premature deaths, the accidents, the very public personal failings.
And the money. You can't separate the story from the immense wealth Joe Sr. built. That was the crucial ingredient, was the lubricant, as he called it, that freed his children to dedicate themselves entirely to politics and politics.
It absolutely enabled their political lives. But maybe, just maybe, that same wealth, that immense privilege that also complicated their mission. Did it enable a lifestyle that sometimes tipped into recklessness? Did it contribute indirectly to tragedies like Chappaquiddick or the addiction issues and accidental deaths that plagued the third generation?
It raises that fundamental question, the one the sources keep circling back to, the one that maybe doesn't have a simple answer. And it's the thought we want to leave you, the listener, with today.
Were the Kennedys, at the end of the day, just a family of incredibly privileged, wealthy individuals who grabbed power but didn't fundamentally change society all that much? Or are they better understood as a truly tragic dynasty? Individuals who genuinely tried to use that immense wealth and power to make America better, but suffered almost unimaginable loss and catastrophe as a direct or indirect result of that very.
Think about that central iron, how the very thing that made their public service possible, the huge inherited, might also have sown the seeds for so many of the complications and the relentless tragedy that seemed to follow them ever.